Okay, I'm happy to start it off. I'll correct you that I'm not actually a co-PI on the grant that funds CARC. I'm just the chair of CARC, and we'll talk a bit about what the roles are within CARC and the governance process that we've assumed over the last 4 years. So this is all about the research, computing, and data community and how we support professional development and develop our profession, how we move forward. And Dana, I guess we can move forward to the next slide. What we want to be our principles, and this is in our charter, which we're just about to wrap up when Bob finishes his last sentence that he owes us today or tomorrow. But what we're trying to be is an inclusive, transparent, trustworthy, collaborative group that's governed by a rough consensus-driven process. We want to collaborate with different people and have shared attribution and credit for the things that result. And all the activities are community owned and open. We try to facilitate activities and span boundaries among the community. And we really do welcome partners and collaborators with shared credit and attribution. If we think about the research, computing, and data community, it's not super large. And if we try to fraction it off into different silos and not work together, we're never going to succeed in getting it to become a profession. So various partners that we've had so far are Internet2, EDUCAUSE, CASC, the Campus Champions, CNI to some degree, and others. And we welcome people to work with us. And at the end, we'll have a call for participation that says, any of you want to get involved at any level, please contact us. Next slide. So we're just a group of volunteers that are trying to develop, advocate for, and advance research, computing, and data and associated professions on our campuses. And research, computing, and data is very broadly defined to include everything about supporting researchers beyond the desktop. And really an important element is including the people that do this and facilitate these efforts. And that's almost, it's much more than just infrastructure. It's really how do we support bridging researchers to the technology. The activities include a community, which we call the People Network, to be as generic as possible. And the People Network, coordinated by Lauren Michael and Dana Brunson, has various tracks that you've heard of, probably the researcher facing, the systems facing, emerging centers facing, and others. And they run effectively year-round virtual conference with these focused tracks. Many of the calls are on YouTube. In addition, we have a series, basically a tier of activities that are groups of volunteers that get together. The simplest one is an interest group where you're just having discussion. It has some minimal expectations, but it may lead to converting into a working group. A working group is kind of the heart of some of our activities, where they have specific objectives, timelines, and hopefully products that emerge from that activity. A few of them are just listed in the slide there. There's the professionalization of workforce development, which we'll hear about from Patrick, I believe, or Scott, if he's here. There's developing the capabilities model for research computing, which, if you've heard of maturity models, we renamed it to be, rather than rating someone as immature, we wanted to say you're capable or you're not capable. So we have a capabilities model that ranks across the facings, various activities. You'll hear about more of that, definitely from Patrick. We had a group that was working on the ecosystem of research, computing, and data. Many of you on this call were at that workshop and that's kind of evolved a bit in recent times, and we'll hear a bit about that from Dana. And then another part of our structure is we have some operational activity groups. These are the people that keep the lights on, that run in the web page, doing communications, the kind of the activities that keep CARC going. And the main group of this is the logistics group at present. Next slide. Oh, and here's kind of, this is a nice illustration that Patrick developed that kind of talks about the different activities. So you've got at the top, the working and interest groups, and the wider or fatter box shows more activity. So we had a stakeholder and value proposition working group that developed an initial set of stakeholders and value propositions. It's kind of waned. It's basically done. Other groups are coming about, and I'll talk a bit about the Decadal Survey working group later. We have the various tracks, those that are active and those that are kind of planned, including software facing, ideally in collaboration with the research software engineers, strategy and policy facing, ideally working with CASC and potentially EDUCAUSE. Next slide, please.
And actually, can we go back or stay there? Just one more brief point. Sure. In the rest of this presentation, you'll hear about all of the working groups that are in that darker green, bigger box at the left, except for engagement. We've recently been discussing that engagement is more like the logistics group as an ongoing activity group for the operational aspects of CARC. But you'll hear about professionalization, capabilities model, ecosystem working group, which is winding down, kind of like stakeholder value proposition. And you won't hear about stakeholder value proposition. It is already wrapped up. So.
Well, we have one more meeting we'll have to do, but
yes.
But thank you, and feel free, anyone who wants to break in, please do. So in terms of governance, I was originally elected as the CARC chair, and then the process of governance kind of broke down, and so I'm currently in a role as acting chair until I get kicked out. We have the chair's leadership team, which is effectively the people network coordinators and also the chairs of the working groups. And we can invite in the chairs of the interest groups if we wish. And the governance works by kind of a rough consensus, which means that unless someone has a truly serious objection, we all kind of come to consensus on our decisions. Patrick, if you want to explain it better than me, you can.
I would just say, yeah, the idea is not to reach complete consensus, recognizing that is a very difficult goal, but rather that it's the rough sense of the group that we want to proceed, and nobody says, I cannot live with this. This is the model that I learned about doing standards at the W3C, and I'm a big fan of it in terms of making progress on things that are hard.
We also have some grants that support some activities, and obviously the PIs of those grants are responsible for managing the funds and how they're spent. They're part of the governance in some sense. And then the logistics operational activity group is also involved in governance, although currently all of our logistics group are chairs of committees anyway, so they would be on the chair's leadership team. We hope in the very near future to create an advisory committee of people from the community that can meet quarterly to help guide us further on our activities. But that kind of gives you an overview of how we're governed at present. And it really does, it really is about the chair's leadership team. It's not a top-down process. It's really us getting together and talking and trying to figure out what to do. Next. Patrick or Scott?
Sure. So I guess Scott's not on. The idea of professional development really is, that the community broadly has described the need around this. And there's a couple of areas that the group has been working on. Sorry, I haven't gone through these particular slides.
I can do it.
You want me to add? There's next slides. Oh yeah, Lauren can go.
And go ahead and show the next ones. I was planning on doing this, but everybody beat me
Oh,
to
Okay,
the
you can do
Laura,
it.
punch.
Yeah,
do it
go
then.
for it.
Good.
So,
There's all 3 points.
so our audience will note that just about any of us can talk about this stuff. But part of why we formed CARC and some of the gaps that were identified and addressed fairly early are reflected in what I think is the People Network and also the work of the professionalization group. And they stem sort of from these questions of, in our field of work, in research, computing, and data positions, cyber infrastructure positions, however you like to label them, there aren't many resources, or at least not standard resources available for professional development in terms of building skills, onboarding and training new staff. While there are some parallels in the enterprise IT world, that's really not well aligned necessarily, as we all know, with needs in research, computing, and data. And most of us, especially prior to CARC and some other efforts, were, calling up colleagues, going to conferences, or just learning by doing, which is still a lot of what we do. But conferences are generally once per year. And these other sort of mechanisms don't necessarily give a breadth of exposure to the perspectives of others who might be tackling similar problems, as well as missing opportunities for synergy. And so one of the first things that CARC did, reflected on the next slide, was to draw from the, I think, successes in adjacent fields and even within our field for more focused communities to build a very inclusive community of anybody in research, computing, and data. And that operates kind of like an ongoing conference, which is how we've referred to the People Network sometimes. In that, there are focused tracks that each have their own threads of discussion, just like a conference would have tracks with topic areas specific to those tracks, but not without accommodating the fact that there will be overlap of ideas between different tracks, and that participants will definitely participate in and move between tracks as they see fit. So the tracks within the People Network, as you've experienced as members of the researcher-facing track, are not meant to be mutually exclusive. We certainly have people signing up, joining any number of multiples, some people joining all of the tracks, depending on their particular role and interests in their position. So the tracks we have already are researcher-facing. You can go ahead to the next slide. Researcher-facing, data-facing, systems-facing. And while we don't have a software-facing group or track, that's partially because that's already well represented in the research software engineers, if you're familiar with that effort. Though those are sort of the 4 facings that I'll also talk about, were identified by the effort to professionalize RCD roles in terms of HR frameworks. And so we'll get to that in a second. We've also started an emerging centers track, and it's not that the tracks have to be limited to these facings per se, but just like at a conference, if there's significant enough interest around particular topics like emerging centers, we can certainly consider tracks for those. So as community members participating in CARC, you can bring ideas to the table for other tracks, but emerging centers seemed to be a gap that needed to be filled, that even amongst individuals who work in these other facings, some of them cover multiple facings, partially because they're at a campus where research, computing, and data services are still blooming. We've been collecting data, and we need to update this at some point because the last time we looked was for the CARC annual report due at the end of June in 2020. But we've had very significant numbers in membership. The membership, even since this data, is nearing 1,000 members total in the People Network. And we're really racking up YouTube views, especially as we use recording more in the track. So kudos to our co-coordinators of the tracks and to community members for really being favorable to recording so that our impact can reach beyond the scheduled availability during our track calls. Next slide. In parallel with bringing up the People Network, which started with the researcher-facing track and then added on the others, we've had a working group for quite some time that has worked on developing an HR framework that represents the spectrum of research, computing, and data positions, and that can be customized appropriately, but meets requirements that HR entities typically expect at campuses. And this was to address recognition of a national shortage of research, computing, and data personnel, that without clearly defined positions and career paths, this isn't necessarily an obvious career path to many people who might be very happy in it. We have high employee turnover documented in various ways because of difficulties in training and recruiting, and also communicating career paths and understanding what those are. We've always had a need, I think, for occupational distinction from enterprise IT. And because of all of these things, we've had precarious employment and career advancement opportunities, whether you see that from the perspective of an employee or from the perspective of somebody who's hiring individuals in research, computing, and data. Next slide. And so what the professionalization group has done, and you can go to our CARC website and see where these materials are linked from, is to identify research computing as a job family that still fits under information technology, but is distinct from traditional enterprise IT infrastructure, like what goes into networks. But where in research computing, for example, we have these 4 different facings recognized, and software and data facing have very similar requirements and whatnot, which is why they were grouped together in the HR framework. But there's certainly opportunity in that framework to customize that it's a very specifically software facing role or a specifically data facing role. So not to diminish the importance of why we have separate tracks for those, for example. And then research networks, it was deemed still really belonged more in the IT infrastructure realm, since those tend to have to integrate very significantly both the interests of research and enterprise IT needs. Next slide. And similar to why the framework used, job function, job category, those types of terms, there are similar terminology and structures within each of the different facings, whereby there are individual contributor roles with different grade levels, and then also room for managers within each of these different facings too. Next slide. And all of the HR framework, like I said, uses common concepts and terminology, that your HR group at your campus can recognize, so that you might be able to help them implement some of these changes. I recently did this at UW, actually. A year ago, we implemented a completely different HR framework, and I was able to bring in specifically what CARC has done, even though I hadn't been on this working group. And it was very well received by our HR representatives and by other stakeholders on campus who wanted to start using some of these position descriptions. Next slide. And I think this hands it off. So just these are from Scott, who's the co-chair, one of the co-chairs of this working group, and has really used Harvard's own experience to sort of drive the progress of that group. There are a lot of future activities and priorities within this working group to help socialize the job family matrix, the HR framework. So if you're interested in any of that, or if you know somebody who might be, we've got some more information at the end of this presentation about how to get involved. Now I think it's ready for the next
Scott
person.
is spinning up work, and there's a number of people who are on the call who are involved in developing an annual census of RCD professionals across the country, which I think is going to yield some really interesting data. And the one other thing that I would mention, if you want to go to the next slide, is this career arcs model that we've been talking about for a while. It came up in a workshop some time ago. We've been discussing it, and we've had various people interested in various things. It's something that's been on my plate, and I was buried in the capabilities model and other things like that. But we are finally spinning up this activity. These are the things that we think will go into a career arcs resource. The idea really is to help folks, either individuals or managers, to understand how do people come into these roles, how do they move within and advance within these roles, and in some cases, where can they go from these roles, perhaps into industry, for example. And so we'll include some narratives of how people are moving into these roles. And right now, for example, I think it's Women in HPC that's been gathering some really interesting career arc narratives around this. Also, examples of effective recruitment programs. This is something that a couple of people ran workshops at PERC on, looking at how do you actually find staff, and how do you find students for involving them in your programs. Where people can go when they want to think about how do I grow within a role, and then how do we work with industry partners. So what is a career arc again, somebody says. So it's, the idea is, how do you understand how and why you might want to imagine a role in research computing and data, a professional role, and how do you prepare yourself for it? How do you find one of those? When you're in such a role, where do you go next? What are the different ways you might advance your career as a professional? And where else might this lead to in a longer term career arc? So that's the idea behind a career arc, is the arc of how you proceed through different steps. So any other questions on that? Yep, sure. All right, next slide. So the next element, and this is something, this is another group that I'm involved in, as well as Dana and Claire and a number of others on the call. We had people coming to us and coming broadly asking, how well is my institution supporting computationally and data intensive research? How do we get a comprehensive view of that support? And what are we not thinking about that others have indicated or believe is important? And then how can we pin down, if we're thinking about a strategic plan, how do we identify areas for improvement? Next slide. So the capabilities model is really designed to address these questions, and it provides a structured model for assessing support for computationally and data intensive research, makes it easy to find gaps and mark areas that are important for your institution that you might want to devote resources to. Obviously, once we have a lot of people working with this, we can develop an understanding of how the broader community thinks about this kind of support, and to gather baseline data about our community and subsets of our community, so that we can inform our own decision makers at our campuses, if we think about benchmarking ourselves relative to the community, but as well to have this national baseline of data to inform policymakers and funders and whatnot. Next slide. So who's using it so far? We had a total of 125 institutions who have downloaded it across 44 states and a couple of Canadian provinces. And you'll see there's a good mix of different Carnegie classifications and some representation from minority serving institutions, Hispanic serving. We clearly want to do a little more push on some of the HBCUs and TCUs. But we've got, the number of folks that are downloading and that have actually completed and contributed data pretty closely reflects the mix broadly of R1 and R2 universities across the country. So it's a pretty representative data set. And what do we get out of this? Next slide. This gives you a sense, this is just one of the data samples of, for example, within data-facing areas, if we look at the difference between states or institutions that are in EPSCoR states, these are states that receive less than 0.75% of NSF funding, versus states that actually are getting quite a bit more of the NSF funding. And we see that while some areas like data creation and compliance that may be more regulated, there's some closer comparability. In certain areas in particular around secure sensitive data or data viz, there's really stark differences. And having this data allows us to actually point at it and make the argument, not just ad hoc based upon conversations with one another, but really based upon data. There's some real differences here that we may well want to address. So that's just an example of the kind of data that we can get, or the kind of insights we can get from the community out of this kind of data. So that's what I had to say about the capabilities model.
Thanks, Patrick. So I'm going to talk about the ecosystem. We'll see if it's working or interest, depending on how many emails I get after this. it began a couple years ago as the Ecosystem Workshop Planning Group, with the aims of, connecting the community members. So think about community organizations, CARC, champions, BD hubs, the list goes on, and how many options there are, as say a researcher facing CI professional to be able to come into this ecosystem and even figure out which way is up. And so we wanted to connect these organizations and leverage one another, be able to support each other, be able to kind of create some coherency and coordination amongst all these different groups, and then identify gaps that may not be well served currently. So here's a bit of the timeline of what has happened. Of course, you see the same principles here as CARC in general: inclusive, collaborative, sustainable. And so we formed this working group in the fall of 2018. We had a workshop co-located with the CNI member meeting in St. Louis in April 2019. And then we gave so a couple subgroups came out of that. One was to do a clearinghouse survey to try to get the various organizations to fill in, their missions, their funding, their connector points, what they would hope to get out of, being a part of a collaborative group like this. We did a plenary panel at PERC, and then we kind of slowed down a little bit, right? Because after all of that work, we were a little bit tired, but then we thought we should really write some of this stuff down. So we did submit and get a paper presented at PERC 20 and did a presentation there. So now where we are, and here's kind of a diagram of the various groups that attended the workshop and contributed ideas, and we have full talks and papers on all this stuff, but I wanted to be a little bit quick. Oh, I see one of my slides is missing, but what we'd like to do next is, kind of figure out what the next work streams are. Because when you think about ecosystem, and me in particular, really would like a way for, emerging centers or new people in the research, computing, and data field to have a place to kind of get a grasp of what the ecosystem looks like. What are the large animals? Where are the dragons hidden? Things like that. What are the resources? And because as you all know, you kind of learn all these things in a very ad hoc way, and a lot of the people, and this is hard work, right? Because the minute you write anything down, it becomes obsolete. So trying to develop some sort of framework where we can help those in the community know where the resources are and how to get to them. So that's the ecosystem. If you're interested in any of those ideas at all, please let me know, because I'm bound and determined to figure out if this is going to become into a new working group, or if we want to do an interest group or something, just to keep this momentum going and leverage the work we've done. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it over back to Tom for the Decadal Survey.
Yeah, I'll note that we also had a workshop in the fall that Dana helped organize that was about professionalization of the workforce, and essentially the community of communities. There's another group that Dana, I, and Lauren are involved with that is the community of communities group. The question is, how do we morph all these efforts into a coherent plan? And that's what Dana is trying to do. And Dana also talked about sustainability, and I would call that an aspirational goal. We're certainly not among the community sustainable in any of our efforts across many of these communities, with a few exceptions like the carbon trees, which seems to be definitely sustainable. But others, this is what we're trying to push for, what we're trying to advocate for. Now, out of one of our meetings we had with CARC to try to figure out the future, the idea of a decadal survey came up as an important thing. This is something that's done in like astronomy and other fields, where they try to figure out the 10-year plan for where you're going to build your astronomy instruments and so forth. And we think this is important for research, computing, and data. This hasn't been done. for our field. Do we think we can do a 10-year plan? Probably not. It's more like a 5-year plan or a 4 to 5 year plan. There was super enthusiasm. We formed a working group, and that working group met once in 2019 and once in 2020. So we're now trying to reinvigorate it. This is now an interest group because it hasn't developed its charter. It hasn't figured out its working goals, but Ruth and I are trying to do this now. And the idea is to write a concept paper about the importance of this, vet it with the community, seek out white papers from the community, discuss the concept paper with various stakeholder communities to see if people are interested, and if there's community consensus, to move it ahead and identify resources required to fully execute such a survey, hold a workshop. Both Exceed and the leadership class Frontera projects support this and are willing to contribute funds to help support this. So we're having our first meeting the end of this month to try to reinvigorate it, and then we'll set up monthly calls. So if people are interested in this, this is a call for participation. And if we go to the next slide, I think that kind of says that. Yeah, so who wants to present this, Lauren or Dana? Or I can do it, I guess.
I can.
Yeah, perfect.
So
that's for that was the last ecosystem slide that I was missing earlier.
okay,
I put it in the wrong. I inserted a slide. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
We're highly coordinated.
Clearly. Well, this is the next. The broader get involved with CARC is on the next slide, but I said this earlier. That is, if people are interested in actually digging in and doing some work to develop some materials for the ecosystem, that's that slide. So, and then I'll let Lauren do this one if you want, or not.
Yes, this is the one I was prepared to do. Sorry. So we've been, trying to figure out how we can better communicate how and why community members can and should get involved in CARC, even just to the extent that all of you are participating in the researcher-facing track, for example. But certainly if any of you have inklings of wanting to be more involved, one of the things that we can definitely use help with is how to articulate the value proposition of getting involved. But some of what we hope is that value is that your investment can vary based upon your level of interest. So depending on whether you want to join a working group or want to get more involved in coordinating a track or serving on a steering committee, this can be a few hours a month commitment to more like a few per week as you choose. And none of the ways so far that any of us are participating means that you'd have to stick with it for a really, really long time either. There are definitely opportunities to get involved for short stints. And we've made an effort to make sure that, especially those who are coordinating efforts or co-chairing working groups, have ways to step away and find replacements, which is also really an important benefit, we think, to making sure that various members of the research, computing, and data community can develop their own skills in leadership and communication, right? If it's the same group of us who are always leading things without rotating in new perspectives, we're also not providing good opportunities for as many people to benefit from the professional development skills that I think are inherent to community leadership, whether it's in a working group or something more like a community organization effort like a track coordinator might do. But other benefits besides the ones inherent to you that you might be able to communicate to your supervisor if you are in need of their approval, for example, is that this helps you grow your professional network, which can strengthen your organization's perspectives and potential collaboration opportunities, building a national profile for not just yourself, but your organization, and also ensuring that your institution's interests and perspectives are represented, whether it's a fairly informal conversation in something like a track call, or in some of these working groups that are working to establish community agreed upon standards for evaluating research, computing, and data programs, services, implementing HR frameworks like we discussed, et cetera. And there are a number of us who are happy to help, especially because there are a number of people who've been leading the working groups who are supervisors themselves and who see the benefit for their own teams. So I know we've got people who are center directors who have specifically offered to talk with, say, your center director if you're looking for help in making the case that you might elevate or escalate your participation in CARC. Next slide. So just a summary of current opportunities. You can join any working group at any time by contacting the co-chairs. And if we haven't made this clear, but we've tried to on the website and in various ways, I think there's more that we can do to promote that this is available. And I know that it means that you have to kind of go out of your way to figure out where to go and meaning which working group and then contact that person. But we're also, I think, looking at opportunities for specific working groups to make specific calls for participation when they need or could benefit from new perspectives and contributions of effort. For example, you've seen some calls from the track coordinators who have rotated in and out in the last 2 years. And so be on the lookout for those opportunities. Those are ones that will generally always come with a call for interested individuals to step up. And as Patrick mentioned, the professionalization career arcs group is specifically looking for more material contributors and even just reviewers and input providers as they develop the career arcs. Patrick dropped a link very conveniently in the chat if you'd like to learn more about that and to contact the chairs. Anybody else have things to say here? All right, I think that's all that we had planned in slides. And so we can spend all of the rest of the time answering any questions, particularly if something that we talked about wasn't clear, or if there was something that you expected us to talk about that we didn't.
Can I do just a very quick recap and then throw the ball back to y'all to make sure that we got everything?
Sure.
Okay, so I think what I got from what was shared is that there's kind of several theme areas that the CARC is working on with different working groups. Those include professional development, including the professionalization working group, institutional capabilities with the research computing capabilities model. It wasn't clear if there's still an active working group with that, or that's kind of developed and now there's ongoing support. So maybe someone can clarify that. There's an active working group as well. Okay.
It's an annual survey, and we're actually we're hoping to get funding to actually re-implement the thing on a more robust platform and build a dashboard for the community and so forth and so on. So lots of work going on.
And Patrick has the first public report is available. We need to advertise it more probably with the blog and the webpage.
But I did put a link to that in the notes.
Great.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And then kind of an ecosystem interest group, working group effort being led by Dana, and a more kind of national capabilities effort with the Decadal Survey interest group being led by Tom and Ruth. Is that kind of the 4 main ones? Is there anything I left out in my summary?
Well, I'll add that one thing we have is a common structure in terms of how the meetings are done with rolling meeting notes, a Google Suite with folders. So that's once you're in the CARC hierarchy, you can go to any of the different groups and it's got a consistent format and you can kind of see what's going on fairly easily. Not perfect, but getting better and better. There's the activities and communication as well. And we do have clear procedures on what the working group expectations are for the members and the chair. So if you want to create an interest group or a working group, we have documentation that kind of says what you need to do. And if you want to form a new track, that's also possible. We're working with the People Network coordinators and track coordinators. And Claire, maybe you want to mention a few words about the engagement activity.
Right. So thanks, Tom. The engagement working group has just kind of moved from working group to an activity group. So it's ongoing. I might mention that working groups have a very specific deliverable. So that's why you saw in that graphic that those that some of those were kind of ending, and that's why they're ending, because they had very specific goals to meet. The engagement group is really, in a nutshell, an outreach activity for CARC, finding new RCD folks to participate in CARC and to help those already in CARC to become more active. So right now we're dabbling in communications and working to help with consistent messaging and branding. And we always need more help in this activity. So, contact me or Bob if you want more information. But we want to make it easier for people to find CARC information that will help them, and current members who want to get more involved.
And just to emphasize sort of what a number of people have mentioned, but we described what's going on now, but the whole point of CARC is not that we define what our, what we think we should be and people have to fit into that, but that it's the community that really decides what's of interest, what needs to be done. And if you've got some idea for something that you really think, hey, somebody should be doing this, please propose an interest group, which is really lightweight if you just want to get people together to discuss it. Or if you already have concrete ideas and say, this is what we should do, propose a working group. It's really the community that defines this stuff. And the main point of, for example, the logistics group is to make it easier to do that. Tom mentioned the common framework that we provide. The idea is just to make it really easy for you to get together and do stuff that you think is important to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary. I mean, kind of tying together everything that people have said since we stopped officially presenting. I think what CARC does is try to bring people together across the research, computing, and data community so that they can identify common causes and efforts that they'd like to work on together, and then provides infrastructure like Google Groups, Google email lists, whereby a working group or a track can organize itself, whether the goal be just discussion like in our tracks or toward completing some significant task that will benefit the larger community. And I think the capabilities model, and Patrick mentioned, pursuit of external funding is also a really good example of how CARC in that way can be kind of an incubator. That, we mentioned sustainability, and I think there are questions still about how we sustain this core effort. If it will be fine on volunteer effort, then great, because I think it does provide opportunities for contributors to develop their own leadership skills. But it certainly makes sense for some of these working groups to sort of stretch their wings and go forth with some funding, if that makes sense for the work that they've done and that they need to continue to do.
Yeah, I'll also say that I do a lot of CARC meetings during the week, and they're my funnest meetings. A lot of my other meetings are not so fun.
Yeah, I think, we go on and on about the kind of the infrastructure part of a working group and kind of best practices about leading a working group. And we did that because we all learned the very hard way of being in working groups that were not any fun, and you spin your wheels and you don't feel it. You keep showing up to meetings, but nothing happens. And so that's a lot of what we've kind of tried to write down with the working group. Here's, do folders like this, and here's the way to do group notes and set objectives and get people to do stuff.
And we've also set up a quarterly review process now for all the working and interest groups to assess what they're doing and nudge them, or, demote them from a working group back to an interest group or at all. So it's taken, as Dana said, it's taken a long time. I mean, we're 4 years into this, I think, and we've learned a lot over those times, and we're still evolving. Questions?
Somebody asked in the notes for a link to the call for participation. We don't have an overall call. Basically, if you go to the CARC website and explore the working groups and interest groups, find one that looks like it matches your interests where you'd like to contribute, and then there's links there to the chairs or other means of getting involved. We don't have just a broad call in that sense.
Yeah, there's a page that's how to join or how to get involved. that I just linked in the chat that is basically a summary of what Patrick said. And it really is, explore what CARC is doing and find out what motivates you. And if you're still not sure, that page even says that you can email help@carc.org and we'll help you figure it out.
And there's a lot of different ways to get involved. That's one of the other things we want to make clear is, if you're really motivated and you've got some really strong ideas and you want to drive something, that's great. You can become a chair and get involved and really drive something. If you just want to learn about it or contribute to it, you can be an active member, or if you just want to lurk and have some awareness and maybe occasionally chime in, that's fine too. There's a lot of different ways to be involved, and we value all of them because everybody does they can contribute in different ways.
And it's important to get diverse perspectives and new ideas. If it's the same people doing the same thing every time, we don't evolve.
I guess this is for open questions. So hello, everybody. My first CARC meeting. I think I officially signed
Welcome.
up, 3 days ago, Oren? Anyway, this is Mike Benedetto from American Museum of Natural History. So I know some of you, I've met some of you over the years, but I think one interesting area might be, I think places like us represent kind of new and emerging data areas, research computing areas. So most people, first of all, when I met many of you, the first question on your mind is, why is a museum here? And second of, you have how many researchers was generally the second question, because we have over 200 researchers on site, many of whom are voracious in their need for computational power that we've been trying to give them. So thank you to everybody who's helped us along on that way. But has there been any thought about kind of mentoring smaller institutions who may be starting into this area, or some kind of a methodology for bringing them in? I mean, I know about CARC because I know Lauren made sure I knew about it. I know about, campus, champions because, I've heard about it from Dana and different people. I am very, anybody who knows me knows I am not shy about just throwing myself into things. Thomas is laughing because we've been on things before. So I'm not shy, but I do know that there's a lot of places that say I'm unwilling or unable to get in because I'm not sure how to do it, or they're intimidated by being in a room with major computational centers. And so I don't know if that's an idea that maybe CARC can do, is kind of facilitating these smaller emerging centers, maybe groups that are looking at new grants, trying to maybe establish their first real HPC or data infrastructure for these things. May be a useful way of doing a little bit of outreach, might bring in diverse perspectives, especially for people that are emerging these things. So that's an idea that, I would have out there, kind of just putting it in there. And I don't know if that's been thought of at all. So if you've already gone through it, I'm sorry for rehashing something.
I would second that, Michael. As somebody like yourself that really broke ground with the Natural History Museum getting a CC Star grant, I think that's a really great point to make.
There is an emerging centers track, and there's good discussions going on there. It was designed specifically to address those interests and to bring together people who are in that situation and people who are happy to contribute there. So.
And I'll also say Patrick's been working hard with the capabilities model to try to bring that to EPSCoR institutions and other emerging centers.
Yep. And just on a complete random tangent, I spent a number of years working to build software for collections management and others for museums and archives. So I'd be happy to talk to you. I'd love to see the intersection of those two interests.
Yeah, Patrick, you've just made it on my list. You may be sorry for that. Anybody who knows me will tell you so.
Oh, I know you. It's a good list.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. But no, but definitely, I think that these are interesting areas because a lot of places don't realize that museums do have HPC. It's like the best hidden secret, in fact, from many of their own researchers. And so that's why we, may be an interesting area, and maybe we can help in that particular way in kind of ambassadoring it, and trying to help out with that. So this is just an idea. I think I'm already going to come to that emerging centers track, so you're all warned. But anyway, just wanted to put that out there in a more formal way.
Thanks for joining.
Any other questions? Jana, all yours.
Well, I just really want to thank Lauren, Patrick, Thomas, and Dana for their presentations today. This was really helpful to get that big picture view and to consider other ways and places that we can participate. In that same vein, the researcher facing track has a steering committee. And if you're interested in contributing in a more active way to this particular track, we'd be happy to hear from you. There's always room for new ideas. I posted a link to PERC 21. The call for participation came out. I just want to encourage people to check it out. The theme is awesome. It's evolution across all dimensions. And I'm looking forward to the t-shirt for that one. Our next call is scheduled for February 11th. We will be returning back to some of our more typical topics around researcher facing issues that are more direct for researchers. But thanks to everyone for coming today. And again, thanks to our speakers. And take care, everyone, and we'll see you in February.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Take care.